This is the Comics Alternative Manga, reviews of Tomie, the complete Deluxe Edition, and Blam, Volumes 1 and 2. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Manga. I'm Derek.
And I'm Shea.
And we're two guys with advanced and soon-to-be advanced degrees talking about manga. And on the December manga episode, our last of 2016, we're going to be looking at two new books, or at least older stories with new editions of both. We're going to begin with Junji Ito's Tomie, the complete Deluxe Edition. After that, we're going to be discussing the first two volumes of Blam by Tsutomu Nihei. But before we get to those discussions, we want to let all of you listening know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Manga is brought to you by the wonderful folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics and manga pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off of the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off of the cover price. Sometimes 50% off cover, but many times you can find discounts that are more impressive than that.
Like for the month of December, you can pick up books like Heart of Thomas and Drunken Dreams and Other Stories, both by Moto Hagio, and both books we've mentioned on the show before, for 30% off cover price.
Mm-hmm. And it's a great place to get not only just comics in general, but manga, as Shea has given some examples of which. So definitely check out dcbservice.com. You gotta go there for all of your comics and manga pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your books there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that Shea and Derek sent you. So, Shea, we're coming up on the tail end of not only December, but of 2016. How has your holiday season been?
Oh, it's been nice and relaxing. We had a good, Nicole and I were running over to her parents for Christmas Eve, and then we had to run over to my parents for Christmas. So it was kind of hectic, but it was also nice and relaxing, and we got to spend the days with our respective families. So that was nice. Yours has been a little more... what's the right word for it? You've been all over the country for this holiday season.
Yeah, a little more traveling than just across town. I left for Charlotte, North Carolina the week before Christmas to see to my dad, and then my family came down and joined me several days later, and then the day after Christmas, we drove from Charlotte up to northern Indiana for my in-laws, which is where I am now, and then tomorrow I'm hitting the road again to come back to Texas.
I am not a fan of those road trips, so I wish you all the best with that fun tomorrow.
It's been a lot of driving. It hasn't been all bad, though, because it has given me the opportunity to catch up on some of my podcast listening.
Oh, that's always a good. Like I am perpetually way behind on podcast listening, so maybe I need to go on a road trip so I can catch up.
Maybe so. But the weird thing is, when I'm in the car, I rarely listen to comics-based podcasts like ours. I always listen to other things, either shows that are entertainment-based like Gilbert Gottfried's Amazing Colossal Podcast, music-based like Sound Opinions, or podcasts about podcasting.
That's really inside baseball stuff.
Yeah. But for some weird reason, I don't listen to comics podcasts in the car. Well, on the topic of comics podcast, this is a great opportunity now to share with our listeners some correspondences that we have received about our last month's manga podcast episode.
Mail time. Mail time. Ooh, the mail's here. That means we get to see our old friend, Mailbox.
And both of these messages are in regard to a discussion or kind of a query you and I had last time. You know, last month, one of the books that we discussed was Jiri Tachiguchi's A Distant Neighborhood, the Complete Edition. And you and I were wondering about the Frederick Bollier's listing as a graphic adapter, and we didn't know exactly what that meant. We speculated. I think you had some potential answers to that question. I didn't. But a couple of our listeners got back in touch with us almost immediately after that show went up to give us some insight. And the first person to get in touch with us, I'm not sure of his name, but his Twitter handle is LeBearN. But he also, I see the initials on his Twitter account as NL. But his Twitter handle is LABARREN. And he sent us several tweets after listening to the show. He said, I have an answer regarding Bollier's adapter role, though someone may have already discussed it. And they hadn't at that point. Then in another tweet, because he sent several tweets, because you can only write so many characters. Bollier, an author himself, translated Distant Neighborhood into French for Casterman. But Casterman at that time wanted to publish the book unflipped to align it with graphic novels published in the same collection. Bollier was tasked with correcting the obvious problems with flipped mangas, left-handed people, etc. Flipping selectively, he did a thorough job, and some of that must be in the English edition, or it is simply based on his French translation. So I thanked him for that, asked if I could share his message with our listeners, and he said yes. And he also said, thank you for our podcast. So, NL, thank you for listening and for responding to us via Twitter. We do appreciate those correspondences.
Yeah, and the idea of having to work on selectively flipping certain panels is something I hadn't considered. So I really appreciate hearing that. Mm-hmm.
And we also, right after that, received an email from a friend and a longtime listener of the podcast, Pascal Hammond. And in fact, when I received this email, it occurred to me that when I last saw Pascal, which was at SPX this year, so back in September, he and I went out to dinner on that Saturday evening, and I do remember him saying, or I didn't remember this until I got his email, but once I got the email, I recall him saying, we were talking about manga, among other things, and he did mention that Taniguchi was one of his favorite manga artists. And I'd forgotten this when you and I decided to do the complete edition of A Distant Neighborhood. So he was primed to answer this question when he heard our November manga show. But he writes to us. He says, Dear Derek and Shea, thanks for your insightful discussion of Taniguchi's A Distant Neighborhood. I wanted to chime in regarding Frederick Bollier's graphic adaptation. Shea is right that Bollier helped with the translation adaptation of the text, but there is more to it. His work ties into the publishing history of the book. The fanfare Ponetmont editions are based on the 2002 French edition put out by Casterman. At the time, Casterman wanted to reach a wider audience with a new type of manga. They worked with Bollier, a Casterman cartoonist who had settled in Japan in the 1990s. Bollier coined the term La Nouvelle Manga to describe manga that focuses on everyday life and has greater literary ambitions than mainstream shonen seinen titles that were reaching France at the time. He felt Taniguchi with A Walking Man was the embodiment of La Nouvelle Manga. While the French publication of A Walking Man was important, it remained confidential. When the time came to publish A Distant Neighborhood, Bollier, who had close ties with Taniguchi, took on the task of adapting the book to the Western left-to-right reading style. However, rather than flipping the pages, as it was done by a number of French manga publishers in the 1990s, he reconstructed the entire manga panel by panel with Taniguchi's input. He also modified the sound effects to match French. That is what is meant by graphic adaptation. This decision of reworking original layouts, even with Taniguchi's consent, was a controversial move, but it really paid off. A Distant Neighborhood became a bestseller in France and reached a wide audience, going even beyond the traditional comic book readers. Taniguchi is now one of the most respected mangaka in France. This success has allowed the French publishers to embrace a very diverse range of manga titles. In addition, Taniguchi's strong interest in French comics has helped form a cultural bridge between the two comics industries. Ironically, the resulting 2000s manga boom in France made right-to-left reading an accepted feature, like in the U.S., so such graphic adaptations are now quite rare, except for Taniguchi's works when published by Casterman. And then he gives us some resources, and then thanks us for the podcast, Pascal. And thank you, Pascal, for giving us detailed information about the graphic adaptation of Bellier's work.
Yeah, this is one of the great things about this podcast is we get the opportunity to learn as well.
Yeah, not only learning about new manga, but learning certain facets of manga industry. Mm-hmm. And not only in Japan, but apparently in France.
Yeah, and I know you and Edward Gavin, you are interested in European comics as well, and I also have a strong interest in the European comic scene, so I really appreciated learning this information.
Yes, yes. Well, Shea, let's get into the books that we're going to be discussing for December. And the first work that we're going to be looking at is a new edition of Junji Ito's Tomie stories, Tomie, the complete Deluxe Edition. And this was published by VIZ Media not too long ago. On December 20th, it was released in stores.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we've longtime listeners of the podcast know that we both are big fans of Junji Ito, and I think we mentioned this back in October for the horror or the Halloween episode. But had you read Tomie before, or was this your first time getting a chance to see some of this stuff?
This is my first time. What about you?
Yeah, this is a work of his that I was kind of vaguely aware of and familiar with, but I had never gotten a chance to read it as well. I think it's been out of print for a number of years.
Right, and this is the first time, at least in English, that this has been published as one complete volume. Mm-hmm. Previously, the Tomie stories were collected in 3 different books. Now, there was a series of works on Tomie that were a part of the Horror World of Junji Ito collection. And the first volume of that was the first volume of Tomie, and then its second volume was the second Tomie book. And then later on, there was another Tomie book published called Tomie Again. And by the way, you and I were discussing before we turned on the mics, we're going to be pronouncing the title and the character Tomie, Tomie, although you and I were wondering exactly how this would be pronounced. Is it Tomie, Tomie? We weren't sure, but we agreed, okay, we're just going to call it Tomie.
Yeah. If we're wrong, at least we'll be consistent.
Yeah.
In our incorrectness.
Exactly. And our listeners can get in touch with us and correct us. Again, we appreciate any insights you guys have in terms of our education of manga. Mm-hmm. So there's that. But also these stories, and these are individual stories. I wouldn't call them novelistic, a novelistic tome. I mean, these are a variety of individual stories. I think there are 18 in all. But they were also published in another format as part of Tomie's Museum of Horror series. And in the first Museum of Terror, the Museum of Terror Volume 1 is the first volume of Tomie, and then some of what was in the original second volume. And then the second volume of Ito's Museum of Terror included the last part of the original second volume of Tomie, and then the stories in Tomie Again.
Yeah, like you said, this is kind of a collection of anthological short stories almost, and so I was really interested to hear how you found these stories, because I know you have a particular interest in kind of short story cycles, and that's how I kind of read these. And so I was interested to hear what your take on that structure was.
Yeah. I think one way of looking at the Tomie stories is as a graphic cycle, where it's kind of like in prose, a short story cycle, where you can take each one of the stories contained therein and read it separately. It stands on its own just fine without the other stories within the context of the volume. But if you read the story within the context of others in the volume, then the individual story takes on a little more meaning. And what makes it connected in one form or another, whether you want to call it cycle, narrative, or composite fiction, is that there's some kind of commonality between and among the various stories. And for me, at least, it goes beyond theme. I think there's some people who do work in short story cycles that believe that theme is enough to really bind the stories in a particular collection together. I don't know if that's necessarily the case, because when it comes right down to it, every author, every creator, whether it be in comics, whether it be prose or what have you, has a particular set of ideas, themes that they keep returning to again and again. So using theme as a defining characteristic that will bind stories together sometimes is not very reliable. But what is much more reliable is when you have a collection of stories like this that are connected by location, setting, a particular village, a neighborhood, could be a region of the country, or a particular character that occurs throughout. And that character may be a protagonist, that character may not be a protagonist, or it could be a variety of different characters that are a part of a community, or maybe even not part of the same town. But there has to be something, at least in my book, a little more than theme that kind of brings the stories together. And so the individual stories, the 18 that we have in this Tomie, the complete edition, I mean, they do have a binding source or a feature, and that is the character Tomie. And so I think that in many ways this collection could be read as a short story cycle. In some cases, one story will pick up from where another left off. Not completely cleanly, but there's a reference to what happened in a previous story toward the beginning of the next. So it reads almost like a seamless narrative going from one story to the other. And then in other cases, the stories are disconnected to the point that the only thing they have in common is the character of Tomie. So you could get, as we do in this collection, a series of stories where Tomie is with people of her own age. And then all of a sudden, we see Tomie in a completely different venue with, let's say, I think one of the last stories of the collection, Old and Ugly, it's the very last one, I believe, with senior citizens, this old married couple. And it seems completely different from many of the other stories in this collection. Yeah, I think you could read this. Getting back to your initial question, I think you could read this within the context of a short story cycle. I don't know if this is the best example of one, but because all the stories have the character Tomie, you could call it a cycle narrative. But there's not much progression. I mean, I think that's where I'm a little hesitant in calling this a cycle. In other words, by the time we get to the end of the Tomie stories, we're not anywhere further along in terms of understanding the character or what the character is going through or what the people affected by her go through. And so, I mean, again, yeah, you could call this a cycle narrative in one form or another, but it's not like other examples of graphic cycles, like, for instance, A Contract with God or Adam Serlich. But how did you read these?
No, I think that's a little more of an incisive reading than I would have, because I think these stories work really well in this kind of format, moving from scenario to scenario, and after the first 3 or 4 chapters, there's a really strong sense of dread associated with these stories, because this character who appears to be the same character but can't possibly be the same character kind of continues to recur in these similar scenarios. And I think Ito does a good job of using that to create affect. But I think you do bring up a good point that there isn't kind of an arc to Tomie's character across these stories. Right. There's not there is no real growth or anything like that. They just kind of function as you could take this Tomie, this complete collection, as a sort of anthology, and Michael Moorcock has a character who recurs. So you see a version of these characters across a number of different universes across his work, and you can kind of think of as this Tomie character as this. We're seeing these different stories that feature iterations of this character, but she's not really the same character. So I think you raise a number of good points about the way these stories fit together regarding Tomie as a character. So maybe Graphic Cycle isn't the best or most precise way to describe these stories. But now when you were... Sorry, did you have
I was going to say, you've mentioned a couple times that these may not be the same people, the female character, Tomie, and there are a couple things there that I wanted to ask you about. Well, first, we should probably explain a little more for our listeners who Tomie is. And then also, I want to get to that comment that you made that it may not be the same character, because I didn't read it that way. But first, let's introduce our listeners to the character Tomie. How would you describe her?
She is young. I've seen her described as a kind of a succubus character,
yes.
And I think that's very accurate. She's a young, beautiful woman who has this kind of this mysterious hold over men, but she drives men to I think the phrase that keeps popping up in these stories is that they want to chop her up into little pieces.
Right, they love her to death. Literally. Yeah.
And we get a sense through these stories that she's able to kind of... She's immortal, kind of. She can regrow an entire body out of parts. So if you cut her in half, there will be two, kind of like a worm, I guess. And so that's really where the horror element comes from, where she will drive men to kind of chop her up, and then there will be 20 or 30 or 40 of these Tomies growing oddly out of hands and feet and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this is who this character is. She's, to call her a femme fatale is to put it lightly. Succubus. It's probably, if you could combine the succubus and the femme fatale, then you get a character like Tomie, with a really dark, gothic twist. Okay. But, so let's get to the second thing that I wanted to address about the character, and that is, you feel that this may not be the same character among the various stories.
Yeah. There's a number of instances where we see, a bunch of these are essentially from the perspective of Tomie, where we follow her around more or less. But there's a number of these where we start from the perspective of this character who has never met Tomie, has never interacted with Tomie, and through some scenario, they eventually cross paths with her. And in these stories, we tend to see... there's one, I think it's the 4th or 5th chapter, where Tomie... Oh, no, it's Photographs, I think, is the first chapter. It's the first one we see where it's kind of... We get 2 or 3 that are...
Photograph,
almost
Kiss,
contiguous.
And Mansion.
Right, and we see Tomie get her head cut off, and then there are... there are 2 or 3 different Tomies. We see her decapitated body growing another head, and then we see her pool of blood becomes another body. And we see a couple of instances of this, and there's another one later, a few chapters later where a man runs across a dying Tomie, and does he cut off her head? I think he cuts off her head, and he takes her head, and then her head starts to grow another body, and I think the implication is that her body starts to grow a head. But they have, in that one particularly, they seem to have like feuding personalities where they're trying to be the only Tomie. They're trying to knock each other off.
I see what you're saying, yeah.
Right. And so the sense that I got was that they are these it's not as if Tomie is a hive mind of characters, or that they're necessarily identical, but that they have similar personalities and that they have identical abilities, but that they are kind of they're so vain that they want to be the only one, and so they're trying to kill the other Tomies or to kind of distance themselves from the other Tomies, since they have slightly different personalities in a way, or maybe they have identical personalities, and because of that they are they be behaving the way they do. But that I think the point I was really trying to get was that they're not really these hive mind characters. They are individuals who happen to have similar or even identical personalities.
Okay.
But that they are unique.
Yeah. Okay. You're right. I guess I wasn't thinking about those occasions in the text where that does happen, where you get different Tomies growing literally out of parts or pools of what had been one Tomie. And there are those occasions. At first I thought you meant that we have throughout the various stories different people who go by the name of Tomie. Which, I disagree with. I think that they're all the same character. It's just we see them in different settings, different situations, different scenarios, to where the narrative, if we want to look at this all together, all the stories together, it becomes something almost like a picaresque. I hesitate to call this a picaresque graphic cycle, but because it combines the short story cycle with the picaresque tale. But in many ways it does, right? Because with the picaresque, you have a protagonist who goes from location, has adventure after adventure, meets different people, one right after the other, and there's really no growth of the protagonist. In other words, the main character doesn't learn anything, doesn't progress at the end in ways that are significantly different from the way he or she was at the beginning. And so I think that there is something picaresque about the character of Tomie, because we see her in different situations with different people, in different scenarios, sometimes that are vastly or wildly different one from the other. But at the same time, they're linked in a cycle or cyclical like manner, in that we have the same character and something similar happens to her and the men that she encounters in all of these stories. So it is something really, really unusual. And this is where overall, I really liked the Tomie stories, this volume, but I don't appreciate it as much of almost everything else I've read of Junji Ito's. And that's because, especially in the early Tomie stories, they strike me as the work of a very young creator. Even the art itself doesn't seem near as refined as the Ito we get in Gyro or in Uzumaki, let's say. So you can tell that this is one of his earlier works. But also in terms of the story that he's telling, I mean, sometimes things get really, I think a good word here is goofy. I was trying to explain the Tomie stories to my daughter Zoe, because several years ago I introduced her to Junji Ito through Uzumaki, and she really liked Uzumaki. She read it, she ate it up, she loved it. I also introduced her to Giro, and I was trying to explain this or describe this book to her, and I said, it's gothic like the others and creepy, but it's also really goofy in places. And so I think a mixture of the goofy and the creepy may be a good way of putting my finger on Tomie.
I think those are all fair observations, and certainly, like I said, we've looked at a number of Ito's work on the show before, and this is by far his earliest. I think this was originally released I think he originally serialized these early chapters, at least in the late 80s,
right?
And
yeah.
Uzumaki is from like the late 90s, so there's 10 years separating the work. These first few chapters and the works of his that we've talked about or mentioned on the show before. Now, I agree with your observations that it's not as controlled a narrative, certainly, as something like Uzumaki. I think Uzumaki is much more. There's a maturity to its writing, a refinement to the way he deals with characters and the way he builds characters, and the way he constructs this long-form narrative that I think is in many ways vastly superior to these Tomie chapters that function in a way that I tend to very much not to like, as kind of hokey, the bad episodes of the Twilight Zone that are these kind of empty plot machinations that are, there really is no character, there's really no real drama. It's simply kind of a clever organization of compositions and scenes to elicit some very cheap response. But in spite of that, I think, I told you before you recorded, I was very, very excited to talk about Tomie, and I think in spite of the leaps in quality, I think certain elements of his work takes in Gyo or in Uzumaki, I think Tomie is my favorite work of his that I've read, next to maybe the Enigma of Amagara Fault, which I like a lot. But the element of Tomie that I like seem to be the elements that you didn't like. You pointed out the earliest chapters and the artwork as being less refined. And I certainly agree. There's less control. There's less of a naturalism to a lot of his drawing. But I think the first 2 or 3 chapters of Tomie are some of my favorite things he's drawn, precisely because there is that lack of control. I was really struck by the way he drew these. There's such a dynamism to a lot of those scenes, and his art, and especially his ink, is so expressive, and you can really see. I think I'm looking at the release, the serialization of these, and they seem to have gone from 87 to 2000 apparently.
Mm-hmm.
And you can certainly see in the later chapters, and even halfway through the book, even his art takes on those qualities that I think people most readily associate with him, and the elements of his aesthetic that you seem to really like. But it was really the first half of this Tomie collection I really love, because there is that craziness where it seems very almost European. If you look at the work of like Guido Crepax or Hugo Pratt, there is that similar fluidity of line, that energy to his inks and to the way he draws people, and to the way he draws certain scenes that really resonated with me. That there's a frenetic quality to a lot of his drawing in those first few chapters, and I really like that. And even the way he draws he inks Tomie's hair, where you see these thick, visible brushstrokes, continues throughout the book, and I really like that. But it looks kind of like Bernie Wrightson in places in those first few chapters, and it looks kind of like Pratt and kind of like Crepax and kind of like
right,
like a really almost like this balance between the refinement we would see from him later on with that very lurid, vulgar kind of aesthetic from maybe like an EC comic, or like an EC comic from like the 50s.
Right.
And I really like that.
don't get me wrong. I mean, when it comes to the art, I know you're focusing on the art and the difference in these early Tomie stories from, let's say, later Ito's work. I mean, I'm fine with the art. It's what I was calling goofy wasn't the illustration. It was the plotting. And what happens with Tomie or the scenarios in which she finds herself. I mean, that gets a little goofy at times. You know, I remember back on our October manga episode where we were looking at a variety of horror comics, and we discussed Junji Ito's Fragments of Horror. And one of the things that both you and I felt in that collection, you know, it is relatively recent, Ito, is that he may be kind of accentuating that kind of over-the-top horror aspect, the kind of unbelievable, strange, he didn't go there, did he kind of feel to his stories, because that's what seems to get attention. And you and I felt that maybe he was pressing down a little too hard on that pedal when it comes to the weirdness. And I thought that some of that could be seen in these early works. In other words, we see with these Tomie stories Ito's penchant for going over the top. Except in these early stories, going over the top sometimes became, well, unbelievable is probably not the right word to use, because a lot of the things he writes are unbelievable, which is fine. It's just, I don't know, goofy does seem to be one of the best words I can think of in describing this. It just, maybe hokey. It's almost as if he's trying too hard. And again, so what I'm calling, not necessarily problematic, but a little strange, and gives me a little pause, isn't the art. It's just the plot elements.
No, I see what you're saying, and I certainly agree with Fragments of Horror. He's playing up the grotesque element of this, whereas I think he's playing up maybe melodrama a little bit, because these stories, there are elements, you know,
that and the violence.
Right, where it's very where you do see the grotesque, but for the most part they are pretty straightforward. Like I said, they're almost like they're written kind of like bad episodes of Twilight Zone, where they're very kind of ham-fisted and very like shocking in like quote unquote shocking in very obvious ways. And I think that's a fair observation about quite a few of the stories in here, where they're very cheap in the stories they choose to tell and the kind of way that Ito tells those stories. Right. But for me, like I said, I think I totally agree with you. I think that's all there. The quality of his writing. I think the quality of the writing here improves as you continue to read the stories. But I certainly agree. I think Uzumaki is the most accomplished of his work. I think it is the strongest writing he's produced, or that I've seen from him so far. But I think for me, the aesthetic qualities of these early Tomie stories are so great that they that I really fell in love with them. And the way that I really like Alex Toth stories. I think Alex Toth comics are, for the most part, really poorly written. I think the stories he wrote himself were not that good. I think the writers he worked with were not that good. But I love reading Alex Toth comics because they are a really pure form of comics. They are this thing that functions in this beautiful visual sense, and they function in this very striking aesthetic way that really just attracts me and keeps me coming back and makes me want to continue to look at these pages in a way that maybe better written or more literary. Things that are styled in a more literary way.
That have more narrative cohesion to them.
Right.
Especially on the believability level. Even within the context of the grotesque and the fantastic. Yeah. Okay, there are two stories that I want to juxtapose here, and to as I guess by way of example of what we're discussing in terms of Ito's unusual storytelling in these early stories. And actually, these are a couple of later Tomie stories. These are a couple of stories that originally appeared in the volume Tomie Again. And these are Boy and Moromi. I think that the story Boy is one of the strongest in this collection. Basically what we have here as a premise is that there is an apparently dead, of course, Tomie, that a young boy finds along the shore of a beach, and she's hidden. And he, comes to her. She's just beginning to, so to speak, come back together and gain consciousness. And she has a lot of cuts on her face and all. And so the boy goes back over several days to take care of her, to bring her things, brings her stuff to eat, brings her clothing as she starts to repair herself. And Tomie begins calling her his mother. And she starts treating him like her son and kissing him. And in fact, kissing him straight on the lips. And so there's some weird kind of Freudian stuff going on here. But the boy's actual parents, the real mother and the father, start to wonder what their son is up to. He's going to the beach a lot, doesn't really say much of what he does there. Sometimes he steals food from the refrigerator and takes with him, but the mother doesn't think that there's much to that. He happened to take one of her dresses one day, but she didn't know what was going on with that. And what we come to find out is the boy, as all men in Tomie's life, becomes mesmerized with her, and he wants to forego his own mother and father in order to be with Tomie. And at one point, Tomie, tells him in essence, who would, do you think that I would want to be a mother to someone like you? And kind of turns him away, which, this is the way she treats men throughout this story. And then that really screws him up psychologically. Now, I think that that's a pretty tight story. And, you mentioned the Twilight Zone. Something like that is what you would find, I think, in a successful Twilight Zone episode, if it were grotesque. Now, the story that follows that, Moromi, is an example of what I call the goofy, this kind of storytelling style where Ito really goes over the top. This story begins with a young man who is beating the crap out of something, and we don't know what it is at first, but it looks all mushy and gooey, and it turns out to be Tomie's body. Okay, so we don't even see the part of this narrative where Tomie draws the man to her, and to where he, is becomes so enamored that he literally loves her to death, right? So we see him as he not has killed her, but is just mashing her up into some kind of goo. And so this guy's friend comes over and says, "What are you doing? What is this stuff?" And he says, "It's that girl I told you about, Tomie." And he says, "You got to help me do something with her." And then so his friend's parents run a sake. What do you call it? A press? I don't know what you call a place that produces sake. A distillery, I guess.
I would have distillery, maybe.
Yeah, and so they end up taking the Tomie goo to this distillery, and they put Tomie in various vats of sake in order to get rid of it. But people who work at the distillery taste this and say, "Oh, this is wonderful. I've never tasted sake like this." And so Tomie, even as mashed up goo, bloody goo, has an effect on men. And of course, all the people who work here who are drinking this sake are men, and they become enamored of it, much to their detriment. Now, the whole idea about mashing her up into this goo that just continues to grow, right? Because it's not like you're mashing up a woman, and that's, you have the gunk of the beaten body. This is getting gross. That is just one human. It starts to, you mentioned earlier that new Tomies grow from parts of her, and that's what happens when she's beaten to a mulch. I guess she's mulched up or something. It begins to get bigger and bigger, even within the vat of sake. To me, this is just really weird. It's wacky. And there are moments like this in these stories that you just have to sit back and enjoy the stories for what they are. It can get a little weird and strange at times, but that's the kind of stories that we get in this Tomie collection.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think certainly people who are familiar with Ito's work will find a lot to enjoy here. But the one thing I did want to ask you I wanted to make sure I asked you before we moved on to Blam was how do you think this these Tomie stories sits in Ito's work, particularly in relation to Fragments 4, which I think is the most recent work of his to be translated to English. You know, we talked about one very common theme that we saw in those stories is that there is this kind of this demonization, almost literally, in certain stories of women's bodies, and we see that again, or at least I saw that again in Tomie to a pretty great extent. You know, we see this woman whose kind of MO is to essentially ensnare men. She uses her body, she uses her good looks to ensnare men, to trap men, to drive them to do these horrible things, and to get them to perpetuate this kind of very evil. You know, I think Tomie is literally this kind of embodiment of evil, and through these actions they are. They give her both what she deserves, in the sense that she is framed as deserving to die, but also she is this kind of in that way she perpetuates this evil. You know, what did you think of the way that Ito, I guess, codes women's bodies in these stories?
That's a good question. See, the way that I read the stories in the Tomie collection is kind of testing grounds of a younger artist who will eventually go on to do something a little more sophisticated later on with some of the same tools and the same themes that he started off with early on, maybe with these Tomie stories. So you're right. I think that what we see in terms of the demonization of the female figure that you and I discussed when we looked at Fragments of Horror back in October, we can see the same thing here in these Tomie stories, but I think in a much less sophisticated way. And so I think he's starting to play out certain themes that he's going to be coming back to in other works of his, you know, most recently in Fragments of Horror. And I think his also some examples of his storytelling ability it comes to the fore here, at least in the early stages with some of these Tomie stories. So, for instance, you know, I mentioned some of the examples of the Tomie stories where some of these pieces are really over the top, like the Moromi story. But then there are others where the stories are a little more restrained and one story is linked more tightly with another. You already mentioned some of the earlier stories that are connected, Photograph and Kiss, where one narrative follows the actions of another to become something I wouldn't call novelistic, but novelette-istic, if you want to look at it that way. There's also in the later stories a couple, Passing Demon and Top Model, where you get the stories being connected in tighter ways as well. So I looked at some of these stories as Ito playing around with disparate forms of storytelling, but also storytelling in ways that connect one to the other. And again, we'll see some of this, but in a more refined way, played out in his later manga. Same thing with the theme surrounding women, right? In the way that women are represented in his stories. I think that here we find the seeds of what we find in a much more developed manner in Fragments of Horror. So do you see the Tomie stories as kind of an early testing ground of a young artist?
I do. I think, I don't know if we get, no, I think it's a pretty good microcosm of what we see Ito do. You know, you see the way he treats women's bodies, but also the almost Lovecraftian obsession that people have with certain things. In Uzumaki, it's spirals. In Tomie, it's this character of Tomie. So I think the themes and ideas that he is most famous for, that people most associated with him, are all kind of apparent in these. So yeah, I think this is it's a representative work of his oeuvre in a way, and I think, to your point, that is kind of this just this extension of this maturing artist, just kind of throwing everything at the wall and seeing what sticks, and producing a bunch of work. And so yeah, I would. It's a very long-winded way of saying yes. I agree with your description of Tomie.
Yeah. Now, I've mentioned a few of the stories that stood out for me in one way or another. Are there any of the Tomie stories that you particularly like or are striking, either in a good or bad way?
Yeah, I liked a lot of, like I said, the things that I really was taken with about Tomie was this. It's almost a European aesthetic, that the way he inks certain things particularly was really reminiscent of a lot of cartoonists, a lot of European, a lot of Italian cartoonists producing work in the 70s that I really love. And so for me, the Tomie stories that I just really fell in love with instantly and that I keep thinking about are ones that feature that lurid aesthetic.
So the earlier ones,
most prominently, yeah, it's mostly the earlier ones. I was going to say there's a couple exceptions. I'm not too crazy about the Basin of the Waterfall, but I really, and I there's certain scenes in, I think, Mansion, but it could be Revenge, that I don't love, where you have the giant kind of tentacled Tomie. But I really like that, the first story, Tomie, and then that sequence where you have Photograph, Kiss, Mansion, and I'm trying to think if Revenge is part of that. It was just this right blend of what I like about 80s manga and about Junji Ito and about EC horror comics and Italian cartoonists like Guido Crepex. There was this right blend of all of that in these first few stories. But I like I said, I didn't really love Basement of the Waterfall, which is an earlier story. And then Tomie 2, which is another one that kind of picks up on the first story in a way. And that featured that same sort of look that I really loved. To the, you mentioned a couple stories like Boy and Moromi, and I think Boy is a good story that I enjoyed quite a bit. And there's a number of those later stories, the more recent stuff that I like, that I think are really strong stories in the same way that Boy is a really well composed narrative. And but for me, the height of this is those earlier stories with that vulgar almost aesthetic.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned Tomie Part 2 following up on that earlier story, Tomie. But there's another one that follows up on Tomie Part 2, and that is Basement. So, again, that's another example of some of these stories are more tightly interconnected than others.
Yeah, and Painter, which comes right after Basement, is another one that it really reminded me a lot of the exploitation and the sexploitation and Italian horror movies from the 60s and 70s that I really like, and that are the subject of a book I've mentioned on the show before, Men, Women, and Chainsaws, that is a kind of survey of the way gender and sexuality is constructed in horror movies, some very good horror movies, some very bad horror movies. And I was really struck by Painter and then Photograph from earlier in the collection. And there could be nothing there, but I was thinking about this relationship between painting and about photography and about what both reveal about Tomie's there's a particular aesthetic quality to both of those media that resonates and reflects Tomie differently. And I was just kind of thinking about Walter Benjamin's The Work of Art and Mechanical Reproduction, which is centered primarily on the introduction of photography and the iterability of photography, but also its relationship to painting and the way it changes our relationship to painting. And so there's probably nothing there, but those two stories, the juxtaposition of those two stories, I was thinking about last night as I was rereading some of these. So there's good stuff, I think, in this collection. There's a lot of really interesting, good-looking comics.
Well, there you go. You have, once you, or when you soon get into graduate school, you have one of your first research projects, and that is a Benjaminian study of Junji Ito's Tomie stories.
That's right.
Well, let's progress over to the next title that we're going to be looking at this month, and this is Blam, Volumes 1 and 2. This is coming out from Vertical Comics, and it's by Tsutomu Nihei. Now, Volume 1... this is previously published, but Vertical is coming out with new editions. Volume 1 came out in the middle of September, and then the second volume was just recently released on December 13th. Volume 3 in the series from Vertical is going to be coming out in March. But we have the first two volumes. And now this is spelled Blame, and of course there's an exclamation mark in the title, but it's not blame, it's pronounced Blam, correct?
Yes, it is. And I don't know why that is, but then again, I don't speak Japanese, so it could have something to do with that.
So I discovered Blam through your recommendation, but how did you first learn about this series?
Yeah, so we mentioned that Blam is authored by Tsutomu Nihei, who is most recently the author of Knights of Sidonia, which is a series I'd heard quite a bit about from people like Dustin Weaver and Sarah Horrocks. And in talking about that series, they would mention Blam, and they would mention how big a fan of that is. And I think Allison Sampson, who's another cartoonist, has also mentioned how much she likes Tsutomu Nihei. And how much, and Blam is this series that in hearing about Nihei kept coming up again and again and again as his best work. And so for a while, it's a series I'd wanted to check out, but it's been out of print for, I think, almost 10 years. I know Tokyo Pop did the original English translation, but it's been a while since those volumes have been available. So it's a series that I'd seen a lot of cartoonists who I really like and who I kind of follow online talk about in glowing praise. And so it was a series that I'd wanted to check out for a while. And then Vertical just put out these really nice, I think they're mastered editions is what they're calling them, of the series. And so it would be a perfect opportunity to read the series and to talk about it on the show.
Okay. So now we have two volumes that have come out, and we have, I think, enough story to really get into it. Although I don't know if I would have said this if we were limiting ourselves to the first volume of the new master edition from Vertical. Because after reading the first one, if you had asked me, what is this about and what's going on, I don't think I could give you a satisfying answer. Or at least satisfying for me, because I was still in the dark. But I think especially once we get into this second volume, things become a little clearer. The story starts fleshing itself out quite a bit more. And I think one of the reasons for that is that in the first edition, again, it came out in September, the majority of the narrative is action. It's a very kinetic form of storytelling, and you have a minimum of text and a minimum of dialogue. But in the second volume, I mean, there's still a lot of action, that makes up the story, but you get more characters, you get more dialogue, and because of that, there's more exposition. In other words, we as readers get to find out a little more about this story world, the situation that the main character, Killy, finds himself in, and really what seems to be going on. I mean, still there's some questions by the end of the second volume, but at least enough for me is fleshed out to where I feel I have a fairly firm grasp on Blam.
Yeah, certainly. There are a number of chapters in that second volume that are entirely devoid of text, that they're just these kind of frenetic movements through this vast space, which I'm sure we'll talk about in more detail. But yeah, especially towards the end of that second volume, you start to get a little more clarity about the characters and about the world that the book is set in, which is good because it gives us a little more to kind of talk about and speculate at.
Right. Yeah, now, in the Blam volumes, the chapters aren't called chapters, they're called logs. And in the first volume, we get logs 1 through 9, and in volume 2, 10 through 20. And, what I was saying a moment ago about the action-based nature of the first volume, that's what took me a long time to get into. Now, there's not much dialogue, not much text in this first volume, and primarily we have the character Killy going through a variety of different situations and different fights. Creatures attacking him, him attacking some of these other creatures. We don't know exactly who these creatures are. Some seem to be humanoid, others seem to be more, worm-like. Others seem more like androids, robotic. But we really don't know much of what's going on. And I think it's the series of action and fight scenes, one right after another, that as a reader and even as a viewer of let's say series such as Daredevil, let's say on Netflix, I'm not one who really gets off on watching fight scenes. For instance, I can appreciate Jack Kirby, but I'm not one of Jack Kirby's biggest fans. A lot of people, praise the kinetic nature of his art, and that's great. It just doesn't really do much for me. It never has. That kind of storytelling, I can take or leave. And so that's what I found here with the first volume of Blam. I found it a fairly quick read because I really didn't have to get into what was going on because I was reading it at surface level, and that's the only way I wanted to read it. I mean, the art is beautiful. It's highly detailed, and I think if I stopped in the first volume especially, but also in the second one, to really look closely, I would probably appreciate more fully Nihei's art and what he's doing with this really vast setting. Because what we have here is a world that is, how would you describe this? Okay, it's this intricate kind of post-punk, post-apocalyptic, cyberpunk, however we want to call it, setting. It's elaborate construction, and we find out later that this stuff, this cityscape, if we want to call it a city, is built by these entities called builders, who seem to be machines. And they are creating this, this megasphere where layer upon layer of civilization is created. And in fact, one layer of this story world is separated from the other by these massive structures that the humans or even non-human characters really can't get through. Now Killy can, and when we first encounter our protagonist Killy in this first volume, we learn after a while that he has journeyed from a different level or a different depth of this vast world, and he's making his way, I don't know if you want to call it up or through one layer into another. And what he's in search of is a human that has what's called the net terminal gene. And so, getting back to my appreciation or my reading of the first volume, I think the art is where it really excelled for me, and the way that Nihei creates this this post-apocalyptic world, I mean, I find fascinating. But it's the action that I found myself reading through fairly quickly. And I didn't stop to really smell the narrative roses, so to speak, until I got to volume 2.
Yeah, so I think, unlike you, I really appreciate action in comics. It's, there's just something about a good action comic, a well-drawn action comic that I think is really powerful and fun and really aesthetically striking. And so I certainly like these first 2 volumes. But you mentioned a number of things that I really want to touch on. And I think at the core of it is Nihei's art, which is super dense. It's hyper detailed. It's very thin, scratchy lines. But also it's set in this city. I think it's only ever referred to as the city. And in doing a little bit of reading on the series, I found out that it is. I don't think the exact size of the city is ever given, but it is at least. The number it has is 5.2 astronomical units. And I guess an astronomical unit is the distance between Earth and the sun. So 5.2 of those is the size of this mega structure. And you mentioned that Kili is kind of traveling up, but maybe inward. And that's something I really like about the series, is that you're not really sure which direction he's going. Is he moving inward, in this kind of from the exterior of this Dyson sphere, or is he moving outward? There's that element of disorientation that I think is really apparent. There's a number of panels where it's like looking up from the bottom of a shaft almost. Mm-hmm. And these stairs, the perspective on these stairs takes on this Escher kind of quality where you're not really sure where the stairs begin and end, and are they sideways or are they kind of coming towards you? And Nihei with this, it's not naturalistic. I mean, it is kind of, because things look generally how they would look in real life, but they're stylized in such a way and they're drawn with such a density and a busyness of line that you get this really strong sense of disorientation. And so for me, yeah, towards the end of that second volume, we talked about, you start to get this more exposition, more dialogue, and you learn more about the world and the characters and this narrative. But for me, I really, really, really was taken with these first 2 volumes. But it was because of these purely visual elements, because of this frenetic, kinetic, dynamic quality of the scenes, but also this space, this world. I was reading, actually, it was pretty perfect. I was reading Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities and thinking a lot about psychogeography and the effect that geography and that architecture has on the psyche. And I think Nihei's work here was really evocative to me, because it's this thing that doesn't really need to work in plot or character. It's just this kind of weird, oppressive, violent, dark, claustrophobic experience that really is affecting on an immediate level, or at least it was for me. So yeah, I think it's pretty clear that I really liked this, and but it seems like the things I liked about it, you might not have liked about it.
Well, no, I think that, now I'm with you on the setting and the way that Nihei illustrates this kind of difficult to explain city, mm-hmm. as it's called, the city, mm-hmm. Where we have these various levels within this, net sphere, if we want to call it that. I did appreciate that, but it wasn't until I got into, let's say, the middle point of the second volume, where there, as we've mentioned, was a little more exposition, that allowed me to go back to the parts in the first volume and appreciate them more. No, what I was saying is I found the fight scenes, one right after another, especially in the mm-hmm. first volume, a little tiring. And again, mm-hmm. it's just because I'm not one who really enjoys or appreciates fight scenes. And that mm-hmm. kind of action where it's, fighting upon fighting upon fighting. In fact, that's one of the reasons why I've never been one of the biggest fan of Marvel comics, in that you have heroes who constantly fight each other. And, I appreciate that to a point, but after a while, I tire of it. But I think that the way that Nihei has built this world in our protagonist, Killy, his relationship to this world, finding his way through, I absolutely love. And in fact, for some reason, I couldn't help but think of Richard Wright's The Man Who Lived Underground, that short story, because I remember the very first time that I read The Man Who Lived Underground, I thought of it as something more psychological than realistic, right? That the way that as he makes his way through this underground space, it's really him exploring his own psyche, which is a way of reading this, obviously, that Wright's short story. Now, I don't know how much of the psychological is embedded in Blam, but I would guess that quite a bit of it is. And I really do enjoy the way that Killy is making his way through this world, and it's new to him, and as readers, it's new to us as we encounter each new space, each new series of residents, and each way that he moves from one level to the next, or from one part of one level to another. I mean, I do find that fascinating. So, the setting of the city, I find intriguing.
Yeah, it's a really interesting setting. I was reading a little bit about Nihei, and it's kind of apocryphal because there's really no citation. But apparently he studied architecture a little bit, and
that makes
when
sense.
he was younger. Yeah, I think that's really apparent if true in Blam, and I really like it. Thinking about the story now, especially the parts we kind of get at the end of Volume 2, which, the last few chapters are really exposition heavy, particularly compared to the story, the logs or chapters we get in the first volume. I almost think that we always ask each other if we're going to continue reading this series we're talking about. And I think I am pretty inclined to continue reading Blam, but there's a pretty significant part of me that I think would prefer if it were just the things we see in Volume 1, really. It's this expositionless, characterless, it's just a sequence of movements and these explorations of space. I think that's something that comics can do very well. They can be this hyper abstract thing almost that's not really it's not really a story, it's not really a narrative, it's maybe not poetry either. It's just these kind of images. It's just a sequencing of images exploring a space without words, without needing to comment on them necessarily or explain them or contextualize them. I think Blam has a lot of that in it, where it's just this figure moving through these, like I said, very bizarre and claustrophobic spaces that are really affecting in the fact that there is really no context for these spaces, for these scenes. So yeah, I was really taken with this, I think, is what I'm trying to get at.
Right. And there's also something bordering on the psychedelic when it comes to what you were just describing, this movement through space. That looks unnatural to us. And I really appreciate that. Now, in trying to describe this series to our listeners who aren't familiar with it, let's get to some of, the expositional elements that we start getting in this second volume, or at least where the second volume ends. And so, we've mentioned there's a protagonist named Killy who is journeying, up, out, over, wherever, from a different part of the city. He's seeking out someone who has the net terminal gene. And toward the end of the first volume, he meets someone by the name of, and it's either Cibo or Chibo. It's spelled Cibo, but you and I were talking before we started to record this afternoon, and we were thinking that it may be pronounced Chibo. And she is, she's a scientist engineer, And when he first sees her, she looks like she's about dead. But by the time we get into the first part of the second volume, she's regenerated enough. And they make their way, Killy and Chibo, to, I guess, through a megastructure, a barrier between levels or sections of the city, which is something unheard of, because usually individuals can't make their way through these barriers. They're almost impenetrable, but they make their way through a megastructure, and this is where the second volume begins. And so they're in another area of this vast sphere called the city. And then they start encountering other humans and also other creatures along the way. And this is where we start getting bits and pieces of the premise, right? The exposition, the story world that we find ourselves thrown into the middle of at the very beginning of volume 1. And so, yeah, I mean, this is, I guess cyberpunk or post-cyber apocalyptic punk, whatever, may be a good way of describing this world and the situation that these characters find themselves in.
Yeah, there's certainly elements of the kind of biopunk and cyberpunk, and it's a kind of weird mix of all these different sci-fi subgenres in this kind of melange of it is difficult to describe, especially since, you know, even towards the end of the second volume, we start to get more information. We start to learn more about the character of Killy and about the character of Shibo, but we still really don't know that much, and we only know the kind of vaguest hints of what their ultimate goal is.
Right. Because you're right. This is, in many ways, a quest narrative, because we know that Killy is looking for someone with the net terminal gene, but then why is he looking for someone with the net terminal genes? Well, apparently the net terminal genes is an extinct, or at least thought to be an extinct, genetic marker that is supposed to give humans, as the story goes, or the legend goes, access to the net sphere. So it's a way for him to transcend the city. But there are other creatures who are trying to, prevent this transcendence into a net sphere. And what are these creatures called? I can't remember. But they'll attack humans who do not have the net terminal gene.
The safeguards.
Yes, the safeguards. That's it. And so, you know, we do have, I mean, there's something of a quest narrative going on here, although the end goal of the quest is still kind of sketchy by the end of this second volume.
Yeah, it's, you know, we talked about it as being a kind of vague and almost sparse narrative, but there are a number of moving parts and different characters and figures and concepts that we are introduced and that characters engage with that it's difficult to talk about because some of them don't have names yet, or we only kind of know very little about them. And so kind of talking about the plot and what's actually going on and these characters' relationships is still pretty difficult at this early stage in the narrative. I think these first two volumes only really cover the first maybe third of the series.
Right.
So
yeah, and you know, I think one message for our listeners to take away from our discussion, even though we may be fumbling around with trying to describe what Blam is all about, it's, you know, if you read the first volume or even the second volume and you're still a little unclear as to exactly what's going on, you're definitely not alone, and that's the kind of narrative that this is. So just stick with it, and, you know, I'm curious to see what we find in Volume 3, which is going to be coming out in March. How the story, you know, what more we get from the story.
Yeah, like I said, this is certainly it's definitely a book that I'm going to continue to follow. Definitely has a lot of stuff that I tend to like in comic books, so...
Yep, I want to continue reading this as well. So, Shea, for our very last manga episode of 2016, we looked at 2 new editions of older narratives. We started off with Tomie, the complete deluxe edition, which came out from VIZ Media early this month, and this is an early series of stories by one of our favorites, Junji Ito. And then after that, we discussed the first 2 volumes of Tsutomu Nihei's Blam from Vertical Comics. 2 interesting stories.
Very interesting.
Yes. And if you want to find interesting narratives like the ones we discussed this month, then you definitely have to check out the website of our sponsor, which is Discount Comic Book Service. Go to dcbservice.com, and there you'll find a lot of comics, a lot of manga at great discounts. You can't go wrong with those guys. And then after you do get your manga there, get in touch with us and let me and Shea know the kind of things you're going to be reading. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message via SpeakPipe, or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up the phone and dialing 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
You can also email us. If you want to email the both of us, you can email us at 2guys@comicsalternative.com. If you want to get in touch with me specifically, you can email me at Shea@comicsalternative.com. And Derek, where can they go if they want to talk to you specifically?
At Derek@comicsalternative.com. You can find us all over social media, such as Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, and YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can find us on TuneIn, on iHeartRadio, on Spotify, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, comicsalternative.com. All the ways for people to get in touch with us, just as others have done from about last month's episode.
Yeah, and we really appreciate when you guys do get in touch with us.
And if you notice that we mispronounce names or titles in this episode, then get in touch with us. Send us an email, tweet out to us, and tell us that we got it wrong. We don't mind that at all.
Nope.
Yep. And we have a lot of fun manga to discuss in the new year, so be sure to check back in January. Until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Shea.
And have a happy new year.